Hi everybody, I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest. I'm joined today by our CEO Jeff Dewar and our editor-in-chief Dirk Ducharme, and we're going to tell you about an interesting little special report that we have for you all about the U.S.-China relationship. A lot of complexities of that relationship, historical, social, economic, of course, trade. A lot of stuff involved in this one. So we have a multi-part series for you that we want you to read and check out. And this little roundtable today is really to give you an idea of what the topics are that we're discussing. And we're going to start with Jeff. Now, Jeff, you were up in Seattle, where you're located, of course. Right in your backyard was the latest ASQ World Conference, where they had a Chinese delegation there. So you had an opportunity in your article to talk about, report from that conference and what you learned there. So what did you learn there?
Well, it was pretty cool. It was framed as the first annual Quality Summit, and the title of this was the SinoUS Quality Summit. And it was basically a one-day, April 30th, 2018, gathering of about 100 people. Several very, very high-level Chinese executives, for example, the chairman and president of Xiamen Airlines was there. Several other chairmen, vice presidents were about the lowest that we actually saw there. Along with Google and Boeing and a number of other folks from the American side. And what they're trying to do is each year they want to put on this global summit that involves different industries, different sectors, different nations. So they chose China because obviously it's quite in the news. And it was an interesting thing because what we had going on was the trade delegation from the Trump administration, led by Steve Mnuchin, was over in China during the same time that the Chinese were over here for this quality summit. So there was definitely some crossover, and there definitely was a buzz in the room in terms of some of the questions that were asked and the way the Chinese presented things. And so what we basically saw was the Chinese presenting a lot of their ideas about quality, what they've learned from the West, what they've learned from Japan, and really kind of showing specific to their particular company what their view of quality was. Now, the one remarkable thing that we heard several times during the day was they like this Silicon Valley style of quality improvement, very rapid innovation, improve on, find out what's wrong, what doesn't really work for the customers, make very rapid improvements to it, as opposed to, designing in quality from the very beginning and mistake proofing everything and design proofing everything in a much more long drawn out process. I found that sort of the high point of the day in terms of the philosophical point that they were coming across with regard to quality.
So Jeff, I mean, you just said something kind of interesting there. Are you saying they're not showing an interest in designing in quality or designing for quality, that they're more at the further down the road from that?
No, that's still very much part of it, but they put what I would consider a disproportionate emphasis on this sort of Silicon Valley style of quality improvement. So I don't think they were in any way discarding the tried and true techniques of quality management. They were trying to take it to the next step and say, is there something that maybe we can do to increase the effectiveness of how we approach quality built on these, tried and true principles.
And from my research, it seemed like a lot of the larger Chinese companies are borrowing from the West in terms of, or are working with Western companies in terms of learning various types of quality techniques, whether it's Lean or Toyota Production System or that sort of thing, that they're in a sense, the same thing's going on with them as what went on with Japan, except it's not personality driven. It's not a Deming or a Duran or a Taiichi Ono. It's Ford comes in and says, "Hey, here's what we're doing," or Qualcomm comes in and says, "Hey, here's what we're doing." Is that kind of your feeling of how quality is progressing?
Absolutely. The words Deming, interesting. Crosby came up as a name. And I didn't hear Duran during the day. But certainly Deming was referenced quite a bit. Toyota Production System was mentioned, the Japanese tech. It was interesting. Instead of putting labels of it with regard to gurus or labels of particular kinds of programs, they sort of nationalized it in the sense they referred to the American way, the Western way, the Japanese way. But that all makes sense to me. It doesn't seem in any way that they're losing the teachings of Deming, by really looking at it in that way. That was right for the era. He came over. He taught a lot of stuff that had been going on in the United States. When I listened to Deming talk, people weren't listening to him in the States, but he found a very enthusiastic audience in Japan. He's known as the father of modern productivity in Japan, the Deming Prize, so on and so forth. We don't really see that so much in the way that the Chinese were talking, but that might just be because we're now in a different era.
But one thing that jumped out at me when I was reading your piece, Jeff, was that there kind of was this lurking cult of personality that was hanging over a lot of the addresses from the Chinese delegation.
Yes.
That was their president, Xi.
Yeah, President Xi was referenced. I tried to actually count it up when I was writing the piece. I must have heard his name 25 times during the day, at least, from all the different presenters. In a very reverential way, this is what President Xi has said we need to focus on. President Xi has indicated this is the first priority, so on and so forth. And I made the remark in my piece that this is not something that you would have heard from American speakers, American executives, by our political leaders. My father was he was on the first initial team of examiners for the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award back in 1989. And President Reagan oversaw many of the ceremonies. In fact, in the article, I actually have a photograph of one of the kickoff ceremonies with Reagan speaking. And, it was never something that, President Reagan said this, and President Reagan has made a quality a priority, and this is a strategic initiative. This was not, you wouldn't have seen the kind of, frequency of quotations of the president or any political leader since him by the Americans. So there's clearly a very nationalistic sense that is surrounding this on the part of the Chinese.
Well, quality is basically being mandated. Essentially, China is trying to rebrand the whole "Made in China." They don't like the idea that "Made in China" in the past has meant, shoddy. It's going to fall apart. It's going to explode. It's going to kill you or whatever. Right. They are really making a concerted effort to change that whole idea so that "Made in China" is like, hey, that's a positive thing. It's made in China? Wow, that's awesome.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Dirk, because it really is, and I want to pivot here to you because your piece talked about this very explicitly, this idea that made in Japan, there was a time when was considered to be
it was a cheap transistor radar. Yeah,
but
exactly.
Things do change, and really your piece was very much down the fairway quality. Jeff and I talked a lot in our respective articles about the background, the history of these things, and why we came to where we are. You very much dealt with the quality of Chinese, where the quality of the Chinese manufacturing has come from and where it is now. So how did you come up with that angle?
Well, it's funny. They all tie together because if you look at the historical background, particularly once you get to Mao and the Cultural Revolution, you'll see how that ties into, and then of course we open up trade later on just shortly after that. When you look at the effect, particularly of the Cultural Revolution, what it had on obviously the populace, which just kind of, I don't think I'm exaggerating too much, basically drove them into the ground.
Yep.
And so now they're coming out of this, they're trying to join free trade essentially, and now you've got all this cheap labor, and now you've got a little bit of money coming in, and now these people, the workers, the people who are making these cheap products, you've got this situation where the growth of the country in terms of manufacturing far outgrew the capabilities, the quality capabilities, let's say, of the people who are making those parts. And at the same time, you have a group of people making stuff they're making things that they've never even owned before. They're making toys when, as Stanley Chow, author of Selling to China, wrote, you've got these people right out of the Mao, era, the Mao generation, the Cultural Revolution. They're making things that they never had in the past. And if there's a quality issue with it, they literally are going, why are you complaining about the paint on this toy? I didn't even have a toy when I was a child, and not out of meanness or anything, but literally not knowing what are you talking about the paint? What's the issue with the paint? I don't understand what you're talking about. There's something wrong with the paint. It looks painted to me.
Yeah.
And my gosh, I never even had one of these things, right?
What are you complaining about?
What are you complaining about? So that was the background.
Example.
That was the background for the whole poorly made in China, to quote a different book by Paul Midler, Poorly Made in China, which is a very interesting book, by the way, really, really well written and entertaining. Poorly Made in China by Paul Midler, pick it up. He talks about in there that you have all these products that are being poorly made, and Stanley Chow points out that they're poorly made just because of the background of the people who made them. And then you see this revolution take place where all of a sudden there's more income coming in. The Chinese start to come, particularly urban Chinese, start to come from making almost no money to be, in China, middle class and upper middle class. The middle class and upper middle class is absolutely exploding in urban China. So now they've got money. So they don't want to buy cheap products any more than anybody else does. So this is part of one of the drivers for quality in China improving. And then, as Jeff just pointed out, you've got it being mandated from the top, saying, no, you're going to start making quality products because we got to improve this brand. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of where poor made in China came from, and how we're morphing right now into good made in China, driven by the middle class and upper middle class, and driven by the top, a mandate from the top.
And Jeff, you think that's reflected in what you had heard from the Chinese delegates at ASQ that you saw earlier in April?
Yeah, with the exception of the history of poverty, that was really sort of absent. The Chinese very much presented themselves in the modern 2018 status that their economy is, and they sort of noticeably did not include any of the history of where they've come from. It's almost, I'm sort of opining a little bit here, but it was almost as though that they didn't want that to be part of the discussion. Here's where we are today, and it doesn't matter where we came from, which, of course, as Henry Kissinger said, I put that his analysis in the article. What they have done since the 1980s is truly an astonishing achievement.
It's amazing.
When he first went there in the secret visit in 1971, there were no skyscrapers, there were no automobiles, there were everyone wore the same clothes. It was just an amazing transformation in 20 years. And he even said, if people would have told him that in 25 years you'd see these skyscrapers and these massive factories and all this, he said he would have thought they were out of their mind to say that China would be that way in 25 years. But it's the Chinese very much present themselves in a sort of first world sense today, at least at the summit we were at.
Well, let's talk about this. But before we move on, let me just talk about this because I think it's important for both of you. Is trend lines. I mean, if you extrapolate that trend line from 1980 until now, and you bring it forward into the next 20, 25 years,
kick our butts.
Well, that's the question.
Nobody, in my research, nobody is doubting that very, very quickly, China is going to surpass us in terms of quality of products. In certain product areas, particularly high tech. I mean, they're right on our heels right now in high tech. I mean, essentially, U.S. and China are essentially neck and neck in terms of quality of high tech products, and they're catching up on garments. They're catching up across a lot of industries. Again, they're middle. You got to remember the middle class in China is it is the largest retail market in the world. The largest retail market in the world. And that is who China is serving right now. So their manufacturers, they want a piece of that largest retail market in the world. In order to capture it, they have to make a good product. And they want to make a good product because they want that market just as much as all the foreigners want in that market.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that, Dirk, what you say is so true because, and it's amplified when you look at the numbers. And I'm really surprised in my research how ignorant many Americans are, even some business people are, of the numbers involved. China has 4 times the population of the United States and well over twice the population of the European Union, and that's 28 different countries. China's population is 10 times that of Russia. It's right now it's 1.4 billion people. So you start saying the majority of those people are moving into the middle class, the upper middle class. You're talking about a gigantic market.
Yeah, we should say the urban Chinese are going to that middle class. There's still a lot of poverty in China. There's still a lot of poor areas
of course.
in there. But still, even just the urban Chinese is still, like I said, the largest retail market in the world. They are really poised to take over. Particularly take over retail, and they're catching up on quality in areas that you never would have. I mean, if you want to read something interesting, look at J.D. Power initial product quality, initial automobile quality, China. They're like second and third. I mean, Chinese cars you've never even heard of, are matching head for head with the U.S. and Europeans and Japan and
Huawei.
Then you can get high tech. You got Huawei smartphones, which are like the leading or almost the lead. I think they're second now third behind Apple and Samsung. Huawei is like right on the heels of Apple and Samsung in terms of the quality of their phones, and they're desirable phones, and they're not cheap.
Yeah, and you say well, China's got still has an impoverished populace, which they do to a large measure, but half of 1% of 1.4 billion people is millions and millions and millions of consumers to buy this stuff, to buy high-tech cars. And
one thing I'm interested in though is that so you covered the history of China from the beginning of time until now.
Yes, I did.
Yes,
Sorry.
you did.
Yep.
So the fact that China is able to do what they've done in almost 40 years, let's say from 1980s to now, almost 40 years, given their history, does it surprise you that they were able to ramp up that quickly?
No. I mean, because when you do look at the history of China over the course of millennia, you see that the Chinese were a dominant power. I mean, America in the post-World War II world pretty much just approximated the power that China had accumulated during the Dark Ages in Europe and even before. When Rome was falling, China was already an ascendant power, and they were ascendant for the next millennia. There's compelling evidence that the Chinese actually discovered America, discovered the west coast of America in the 50, 100 years before Columbus. The Chinese power was such that there always was this cultural memory of dominance, of economic dominance, of societal dominance, of military dominance. So that was slumbering, and the European nations that really dominated China in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, and into the 20th century all knew it to a certain extent. They all talked about the sleeping giant, the latent power of the Chinese culture. So I'm not surprised by it, and I don't think that the Chinese are surprised by it too. Jeff was saying that the Chinese want to kind of obliterate this period of time where they were the conquered instead of the conquering, and that's understandable. But I think that they aren't at all hesitant to think back to the generations before that and look at what that they were. Again, before they really slipped into they receded into more of a inward focus, maybe like in the 16th century. They really had receded from the rest of the world, just as the Europeans were really dominating.
What I'm curious about, guys, is maybe start with Jeff, is so a lot going on right now in the news in terms of trade tariffs, and are we or aren't we, and how much are we going to, and which products, and the Chinese are piling on with that as well. How does all of that play out within the background of what we've just talked about the growing middle class, large retail market, the exponential increase in the quality of Chinese goods. How does all that fit into the whole trade thing that we're talking about right now?
Well, I think that the issue of, you don't want to start a trade war. I mean, to start off being a little provocative. Whenever some of my colleagues say, well, you don't want to start a trade war, my response is, just purely looking at the economics of it, well, what do you think we're in now? I mean, with the issues that, it's everybody knows, and it was also an elephant in the room at the SinoUS summit in Seattle, about the intellectual property infringement, the required transfer of technology, you have to have a Chinese partner, and there's many, many, many horror stories of American companies going there, taking the risk of trying to get into the gigantic Chinese market. You have to have Chinese partners. They learn you've got to transfer your knowledge to them, and then they, within sometimes a matter of months, just go down the road and start their own company, and then they don't even need to deal with you, and they have all the contacts and so on to exploit their own native market. And then, and companies are left literally with nothing, and they just evaporate. Their technology's gone, and the market opportunities are gone. So, there's always that issue. I think that the American side at the summit was very concerned about. Nobody really talked about it directly. Everyone talked about it indirectly, really from the standpoint of hoping that the Chinese were sufficiently developing their economy. They recognized that they would have to play fair. They spoke many times in platitudes about wanting to protect intellectual property. And one speaker said it very well. He said, let me say something about intellectual property protection. We Chinese people are and our companies are developing a lot of our own intellectual property, and that needs to be protected. So it's not just about protecting, the West's IP. It's also, as we emerge and invent and innovate and do all kinds of things, we own the patents and the ideas and the concepts, and we want that protected as well, because we know that in an out-and-out trade war, things could get very nasty with regard to IP theft from both sides.
Yeah, and another thing was this idea that the ZTE company that we all, in some way, shape, or form mentioned, I certainly mentioned it in my piece as well. ZTE is a telecommunications company.
And they were, a lot of their raw material and components came from U.S.
Comes from the U.S. and the U.S., because there was this, and I think it's well established that there was a link that China was sharing. ZTE was selling technology to Iran.
Right.
So the American Congress took actions to prevent that from happening, and ZTE is pretty much on kind of on a death watch right now. And although Trump lately has come out and said that he wants to try to help them out if he can to save Chinese jobs. Imagine that.
Well, except there is the flip side to that, is if the companies here in the United States can't sell to ZTE, it's also impacting American jobs.
And there's another flip side too that even goes beyond that, is that in a trade war, you want to have some leverage, and if you are forcing a company like ZTE and forcing the Chinese government to form their own component shop to supply ZTE and others across the world, then what's going to happen to the American companies that rely on that business?
Which, by the way, is what Made in China 2025 is about.
It's rather predatory. It's rather...
Well, it's like, no, we want to make our own stuff and be our own suppliers.
But also be a net exporter of a lot of this stuff, too. They want to sell it all over the world if they can. Yeah. And the markets are there. I mean, Jeff, we know this when we look at the world economy, that, it's not just China. All over the world, and you can speak this, you spent a lot of time in Africa. I mean, the Chinese are making a huge play in Africa right now. They look at it as a market that has some real potential for them.
Oh, absolutely. And they look at it as a supply base for raw materials, and of course connecting up Africa all the way through the Middle East with the Belt and Road Initiative, and then but also as Africa is developing in many places, that represents tremendous opportunity. And many people have said that the Chinese very much view Africa as sort of their future export territory. And they just put their first overseas military base on the Horn of Africa.
All right, well, last word time, guys. So we have a couple minutes here. So Dirk, your takeaway on this, on the series that we've done, and your piece in particular, what's the message that you think is the most important thing that you want to communicate to the readers?
Actually, it's in the headline of my stories. My headline is "Made in China: From Scary Bad to Scary Good."
Scary.
Well, scary bad because initially, you just go back 8 years to 2000, or 10 years to 2008, the tainted milk scandal. I mean, where Chinese quality wasn't just stuff necessarily falling apart in your hands, it was really, even domestically in China, it was killing people, right? So scary bad, but now they've advanced so quickly, particularly in the tech areas, that it's gotten to the point where it's scary good for those people who are competing against them, because now, when we competed against Japan, which is a tiny little country, we got our butts kicked. And now we're competing against Japan, who is China, who is gargantuan. I'm going, this doesn't look real rosy to me.
Yeah. What about you, Jeff?
China's 11 times the size of Japan, and their economy is about 3 times the size of Japan's.
It's incredible. So Jeff, what's your final takeaway on this in terms of the pieces that we've done? You've read them all now. What do you think about what we're presenting and your piece of it and what you saw when you went up to the ASQ event?
I think that as it sets into the popular press, the numbers and the progress and the size and the scale of the Chinese economy and the Chinese capabilities. And, when you look at the initiative of China, Made in China 2025, I mean, we're talking about 7 years. That's nothing. And, and where they've come just in the last, as you said, 30, 40 years. So I think increasingly it's going to scare the dickens out of a lot of people. Some of the interviews that I did, there were clearly Western executives that were not just rattled, but alarmed at what this represents because of the size of the scale. So it is going to be an interesting road. I think in many ways, anybody who's complacent in the West, particularly in high technology, it's going to make, it's going to spur innovation in many ways, as people will use in the same way that they used Japan as the existential threat back in the 1980s, and that sparked this sort of quality revolution that we experienced. I think we'll have other revolutions that will positively impact, companies and therefore, of course, their customers. But at a larger level, there is talk about the United States, along with Japan, along with Western Europe, or the European Union rather, cooperating much more, not so much to contain China, but to protect vested interests in industries that are well established in the West.
Yeah.
And what about you?
Well, I think that, looking again historically as my perspective on this, I think that we can learn a lot from the past. And I think that, as Santayana said, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. I mean, we have made mistakes in this country, certainly when dealing with Japan in the post-World War world. And I think that, the lessons that we're trying to convey, I think, in looking at this series, try to maybe help us understand where we're at and where we've come from and where we're going. And there are some really big issues. We're pretty excited about what we've reported on and what we found out, and we hope you're all going to like it as well. So check it out. It's going to go ahead, Dirk.
I should mention, aside from articles from Jeff and Mike and I, we also have 2 other contributors. Laurel Tennis did a nice little write-up on Made in China 2025, that program, kind of a synopsis of what it covers. And Ryan Day had a really interesting article where he interviewed a bunch of American small business owners and operators and shop floor people to get their perspective on what these companies all dealt with China and trade, either selling to China or getting materials from China, and what their experience was is like dealing with China. And you might be surprised at some of the quotes. It's pretty interesting. So take a look at both of those articles as well.
They're coming out. Yeah, we really hope you'll check it all out. The U.S.-China relationship in
there's a
trade
link.
equality.
There's a link to the
Yes,
first
thank
article
you.
of the series underneath the player page there, so you can click that, and that'll take you to the beginning of the entire series.
The whole thing. So check it out. Thanks again for all of you for listening in. Jeff Dewar, CEO of Quality Digest. Dirk Ducharme, of course, our editor-in-chief. Thanks for joining us as well. We'll see you guys later.
So.
Thanks, guys.